So welcome everyone to our second colloquium in our series on philosophy and the mental health act. Now, before I do my bit of introduction, I just want to alert you to the fact that Tim, who's here, has made a PowerPoint presentation, but that was planned for an in-person event. But because he's now not here in person, he doesn't want to obscure his own face with PowerPoint, but he has posted the PowerPoint slides in the chat. So if you want, or if you have two screens at home or whatever, if you want to load the PowerPoint and keep it on reference, then, you know, I thought I would give you the time to do that now whilst I waffle on. So this is the third talk in a series of events exploring philosophical aspects of the Mental Health Act and psychiatry in general. Now, before I introduce our speakers today, I just want to say thank you to the Sowerby Foundation for supporting today's events and everything that we run here at King's. For more info about the events in this series and the Philosophy and Medicine Project here at King's, please see links in the chat, which will be posted either now or shortly. And so what we'll do is we'll have a speaker for about 45 minutes. Then we'll take a very brief break for people to gather their thoughts, or, you know, get us some fluid, or dispense some fluid, or do whatever they like. And then we'll have a Q&A with the audience, and we'll make sure that the online audience can ask questions as well. So that's how we're going to run today. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce Professor Tim Thornton, who's a professor of philosophy and mental health at the University of Lancashire. Actually, I think, Tim, that, like, I've heard about you for ages, but I think it's the first time we meet. Well, is it? Have we met before? I think it's the first time we meet.
Oh, don't ask me. Memory of a goldfish. I never remember anything.
His research concerns conceptual issues at the heart of mental health care. Tim is a widely published international expert in the expanding field, and today he's going to be talking to us, I really like this title, about subjectivism versus paternalism, the Scylla and Charybdis of mental health care. So, Tim, over to you. Welcome.
Lovely. Thank you so much. If things go wrong with the technology, we'll all just have to hang in. My technology should be okay, but who can say? I live in Kendal, which is not a place of the greatest of Wi-Fi reach. So I'm just going to bibble for a few minutes and waste all our time just with some sort of preparatory getting my head right around this. Firstly, I want to say I'm really sorry not to be there. When I accepted the invitation, for which I'm really thankful, my plan had been to be in London, because it seems to me these things work so much better with a certain amount of, as it were, core face-to-face encounters. And then we patch on the post-COVID interaction via the web. And there are reasons for that which are hard to understand. But anyway, I've not done that. And my answer, the reason for that is overdetermined by a bunch of things. But the initial reason is that I've not been well. Almost exactly a year ago, I began 3 months of sickness leave because of a nervous breakdown. What a shame that nervous breakdown isn't a description that is acceptable to medical practice, because that's precisely what it was, or what it has been, and what it continues to be. But it's been a really interesting thing, and the reason for mentioning that is just this, that some of the people who are interested in the philosophy of mental health care are interested because of experiential reasons, and some people are interested because they're just interested in the conceptual reasons. And I was always in the latter category, the latter camp. So it's been really interesting then to suffer a kind of mental illness, formerly tediously generalized anxiety disorder. But what I hoped might have been the case was that my understanding of the philosophy of the area would help me with a self-understanding. And it's sort of hugely disappointing that it really hasn't. And that's not so much a problem about the discipline as a problem about philosophy's ability to equip individuals with self-understanding. Maybe this is an area where phenomenology always has got it right. And me, in the Anglo-American analytic tradition, maybe we paid too little attention to what it would be to get descriptions of inner phenomenology right. I found it a really disturbing experience, and I don't really think that philosophy has helped me with this. Anyway, that's one of the reasons why I'm not here. But that connects to one slight quasi-academic thing I wanted to mention as I was sort of toddling along, which is this. I now am filled with much greater respect for experts by experience than I ever was before. And the reason for that is really simple, that to be an expert by experience, you have to have, in a sort of empiricist way, you have to have experience, and that's the form of your expertise. That's the basis of your expertise. But it's obviously not the case that having experience, albeit it may be necessary, is not sufficient for expertise. And when I think back to all the people whose first-person accounts of mental illnesses I've read over the years and on whom I base some of my philosophical papers, I'm suddenly filled with admiration that in the middle of extremis, they were able to take a view of what was going on. It now seems to me, if I can just put a little kind of flag or a connection to another bit of philosophy, namely epistemic disjunctivism, it now seems to me that it's akin to the issue of what the epistemic disjunctivist says about dreaming skepticism. And the story there is roughly this. We don't need to worry with Descartes that we might not know now that we're awake, on the basis with Descartes that sometimes when we're dreaming, we think we're awake, because contrary to Descartes, what happens when we're dreaming, a bit like Las Vegas, stays in dreaming, stays in Las Vegas. And what goes with that thought is this thought: our epistemic justification, our standing, our epistemic standing when we're dreaming is rubbish. But that's because we're dreaming. When we're awake, by contrast, our epistemic standing is in perfectly good state. So I can say now that I know that I'm not dreaming in virtue of the fact that I'm not dreaming. Were I dreaming, and were I in some sense to frame those very thoughts, well, that wouldn't count because I'd be dreaming. And when I'm dreaming, I am, as it were, in Las Vegas and all bets are off. I say this to illustrate my admiration for people who manage to be experts by experience when it comes to mental illness. Despite being in the middle of mental illness, people send us reports from the front. When I have been merely in an anxiety disorder, merely out of kilter with the world because my affective responses are gonzo, I've been in no position to be an expert by experience. And so I'm just more and more filled with admiration for the first-person accounts that we philosophers are able to benefit from by people who've been at the front line and have sent back those reports. Anyhow, that's why I'm not in London. Apologies. Here's a talk which is going to be something of a picture. And I've decided not to deploy a PowerPoint presentation, though I have a PowerPoint presentation. And just so there's no kind of deceit involved, I have the PowerPoint presentation printed out in front of me. If I didn't have that, I've got the memory of a goldfish. I mean, even before I went mad, I got to be 50 and I remembered nothing. So unless I've got something written down, then we're never going to get anywhere. So I'm going to look at my PowerPoint presentation. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I'm not looking at it, but I'm not going to rely on it. I'm not going to show it to you. You can access it later if you so wish. So I'm going to try and speak to the dialectic. I'm going to try and keep you informed in what's going on. That's the plan. Okay. And here's what I want to do. I want to paint a picture. It's just a picture. It's not very good philosophy. Well, I mean, I'm not a very good philosopher, but I'm not even going to pretend today to try to be a very good philosopher. I'm just going to give you a picture. And I'm going to give you a picture in part because I hope that some people who are here are not necessarily philosophers. I hope that some people have a foot in clinical practice. And what I want to say is that I've heard tell in the pub or in the coffee shops of Preston something of the difficulties of an aspect of clinical practice. And I want to say, I think there's a real, I think there's a real issue here. This is the Scylla and Charybdis of mental health care. It's the attempt to respond to a shameful history of paternalism by a stress on a focus on the individual, a stress on, let's say, person-centered care, person-centered medicine. That's, I think, an honorable thing, but I think it comes with challenges. And I think the challenges are essential. And I don't have a solution to the challenges. I've got one little sticking plaster, which is think about narrative a bit. If you think about narrative a bit, you've got a small sticking plaster. Whether it's a sticking plaster that's going to work enough, I don't know. But what I want to do is talk about the underlying issue. And I'm going to talk about that in 3 areas. And that already makes this a terrible talk. Because the talk that says, here's one thing, oh, and here's another thing, oh, and here's a third thing, oh, and here are some conclusions, is already not sufficiently linear. But that's just the way it seems to me that some of the issues arise. And in truth, I could have talked about another couple of things. I could have talked, for example, about values-based practice and how values-based practice also faces the Scylla and Charybdis of subjectivism versus paternalism and other things. And don't get me started. There's a bunch of stuff I could have talked about, but I just want to talk about 3 things. And what I'm going to do is gesture in an unsatisfactory way at them, and then sort of draw some what's the phrase? Grandstanding? Anyway, some ill-justified general claims as though justified perhaps by too much whiskey, and suggest that there's a problem here, and it's a real problem, and we can't escape the problem, and we perhaps might need to think about some conceptual band-aids, as the Americans would say, to help us with them. Okay, so that's the story. Now, because I'm not using slides, right, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so it goes like this. 3 things, and then 2 things. So the 3 things are 3 examples of this problem of subjectivism versus paternalism. And the 3 things are thinking briefly about the Mental Capacity Act, thinking about the capabilities approach to recovery, thinking about recovery more broadly in mental health care. Those are the 3 things: MCA, recovery and capabilities, recovery more broadly. Then I'm going to ask the question very briefly, just in a moment, what's wrong with paternalism? My talk is subjectivism versus paternalism. What's wrong with paternalism? It's a question worth asking. And then I'm going to suggest there's a little sticking plaster that narrative may play some role in addressing the worry that we have. So the take home from the talk is, I think there's a fundamental tension between subjectivism and paternalism in well-meaning mental health care. I think it's exemplified in 3 areas and 5 areas and 6 areas and 10 areas, and I could go on, but I haven't. I'm going to do 3. I'm going to ask a question about what's wrong with the thing we're running from. And then I'm going to think, is there anything we can do to help? And I'm going to suggest that narrative might be something we can do to help. That's the story. So that's the map. Normally I'd give you the map. Normally I'd show you the map again. I'm not going to give you the map because I think that slides get in the way of Zoom talks. I want Jacques Derrida hasn't sufficiently undermined the myth of presence for me. I still believe in presence, and that's why I'm not going to put a slide between us. That's the story. Okay, so here's the first thing, and I'll go through with more speed than one would normally do, so it's going to be less philosophically adequate than you should expect. If you're interested in this, look at the slides, and if you're interested in this, look at some of the things I've written about this. the Mental Capacity Act. One of three, before we get the 2 of 5, 1 of 3, Mental Capacity Act. What's the Mental Capacity Act all about? I think it is a response to subjectivism versus paternalism. The aim of the Mental Capacity Act is to try to give us a way of thinking that people are right or have a right to make unwise decisions. That's what the Mental Capacity Act is sort of all about. So the idea is that what paternalism would say is, if you make the wrong decision, if you say you want to make the wrong decision, there's something wrong with you. And we, paternalistic psychiatric medical care, will stop you. And the aim of the Mental Capacity Act is to say, no, that's not the case. We as clinicians can tolerate disagreement about judgment. We can tolerate the idea that you'll make a judgment that we disagree with. Let's call that an unwise decision. We can tolerate that, providing you have capacity. And that's what the Mental Capacity Act is all about. Now, my understanding, and I have to say, I've only really got this from conversations with people down the pub, was that way back when the Mental Health Act was last revised, the aim was to make it a Mental Capacity Act-based act. So as we speak, we still have the Mental Health Act and we have the Mental Capacity Act, and they sit next to each other. In Northern Ireland, as I understand it, again from conversations down the pub, in Northern Ireland, it's much more, the Mental Capacity Act has dominated the Mental Health Act and drives the legislation. In the UK, in England, part of the problem was that the attempt to revise it was undermined by a worry at the time about dangerous and severe personality disorder, and hoo-ha about that stopped the root and branch revision of the Mental Health Act that was aimed at. So to some extent, and again, this is pub rumor, don't take it from me. I was about to say Google it. Okay, take it from me, don't Google it, look it up on decent search engines. What the history of the partial revision of the Mental Health Act was. But we end up with the Mental Capacity Act, and the Mental Capacity Act is used widespread. I mean, it's used in all sorts of conditions. So if you've got a diagnosis of mental illness, the Mental Health Act comes into play. But if you're, let's say, an elderly person who's beginning to lose some ability to make decisions, then your doctor may well test your mental capacity using the test that's in the Mental Capacity Act. And the aim is to try to do two things. It's to balance, and the whole of this talk is about balance. It's to balance your freedom to make a decision that the doctor herself would not make on your behalf with your freedom to make it because you have sufficient capacity so to do. So the question is, do you have sufficient capacity so to do? Now, if we were to do this properly philosophically, we would have a look at the criteria in the Mental Capacity Act, and we would try and tease them out. I'm going to read out the key criteria, and I'm going to suggest a way of responding to them. So I'll read them out. You don't have them in front of you. I'm going to read them out. Think of me with little Ludwig, my young son, reading out a bedtime story. We select things that will send him to sleep. This is a short story. Okay. So a person is unable to make a decision for himself or herself if he is unable, A, to understand the information relevant to the decision, B, to retain that information, C, to use or weigh that information as part of the process of making the decision, or D, to communicate his decision. So it looks as though we need them all. A failure of any one of them undermines capacity. That seems to be the case. But there are two guiding principles set out in the Act. One is that capacity is assessed relative to a particular decision. So it's not a general status. It's not that Mr. Smith has or lacks capacity. It's that Mr. Smith has or lacks capacity to make this decision. That's a really important thing. And secondly, capacity is independent of the wisdom or otherwise of the decision made. And to let me quote this, a person is not to be treated as unable to make a decision merely because he makes an unwise decision. Now, we have in this the aspirations of balancing subjectivism and paternalism. We avoid paternalism because we say somebody is free to make an unwise decision. Just because you make a decision that medical practice wouldn't go with, just because you make a decision that paternalism would disapprove of, that doesn't mean to say you can't make the decision. But there's a security involved, which is that some people may not be in a position to express autonomy. Some people may not be in a position to steer their life sufficiently, as it were, rationally. And so we need some assessment of their capacity. And so the deal here is the Mental Capacity Act operationalizes a way of balancing these two things. Do you have sufficient capacity so that you're, as it were, okay to make the decision? And is that sufficiently independent of whether we approve of your decision? That's the subjectivism, paternalism. But I want to suggest with far too much speed and not enough care that these are strange sorts of criteria. So, for example, it seems to me that the first condition, you've got to understand the information relevant to the decision. You've got to understand it. That naturally feeds into the third one, which is to use or to weigh the information as part of the process of making the decision. Those two things seem to me to go together. But once we've got that, then the second one, to retain the information, well, what's that got to do with it? As long as we can understand the information and use the information to make the decision, what does it matter if we retain it next year or the year after? Retention of the information doesn't seem to me to be relevant. And the fourth one, you've got to be able to communicate it. Well, I can see why if you are operationalizing this, you'd look for being able to communicate it. But hypothetically, think about people with locked-in syndrome, where no one has yet spotted that the blinking of the eye is the clue to communication. The ability to communicate it doesn't seem to me to be ontologically a measure of whether you have the capacity to make the decision. It may be the beginnings of a really sad story about why nobody spotted that you had the capacity to make the decision, but it shouldn't be built in as an account of what constitutes the ability to make the decision. So it seems to me it falls back to the first one and the third one. The first one, a person has to understand the information relevant to the decision. And the third one, to use or weigh that information as part of the process of making the decision. Now we've got these two together. I don't see why you need the first one. Because if you've got the third one, capacity requires that you can use or weigh that information as part of the process of making the decision. Well, that implies that you understand it. So we no longer need the understanding claim as an independent part of an account of what capacity comprises. And so now it seems to me what the test for capacity amounts to is being able to use or weigh information relevant to the decision as part of the process of making the decision. That's what capacity is. In the Act, I think, if we're being sympathetic to the Act, but also critical of the Act. And so now we have a question, which is, what would it amount to have that capacity and still to make unwise decisions? And now here's the thought, which if we had more time, we should think about at fuller length. The obvious way of keeping these two things separate would be something like the following. There could be a mechanical procedure which comprises what a mind is like, which is able to use or weigh relevant information and make a decision on the basis of it. Bear in mind that making a decision on the basis of it isn't making a decision having used or weighed the information. You got to use or weigh the information to make the decision. Now we get a really clear separation of the process and the wisdom or not of the outcome if we have a kind of mental mechanism. If we can imagine that what the mind comprises is a nice piece of mental software, and we get our software engineers to check that the software is still functioning correctly. And if that's the case, we say, look, it's taking in the input and it's outputting the output and it's all going swimmingly. And then if it takes in the input and outputs the output and we don't like the output because it's an unwise decision, doesn't matter because we validated the decision-making process. So if we had some criteria for the mental mechanism, which was using and weighing information and making a decision on its basis correctly, independently of whether clinicians like the outcome, we'd be fine. But that, it seems to me, is a myth, because the mind isn't, in any sense that we can use, software, syntactic software, as it were, operating on the mind as hardware. What is it to mark out somebody's thinking, their reasoning, as capacious, as having capacity? What is it to do that? Well, I think it's that fundamentally we bowl them a question. We say, what's 7 plus 5? We say, what's 20 minus 3? And they give us the right answer. The mark of a mental mechanism is performance. We do not know whether there is one or not, the software running on the hardware of the brain. The mark of the mental mechanism, and now the word the phrase mental mechanism is to be scare quoted, is appropriate performance over time. That's what it is. Does somebody understand how to reason? Well, do they give us the right results? Does somebody know how to do long division? Well, if we give them the question, will they give us the right answer? And so I think there's a tension in the Mental Capacity Act between two things it wants to bring to bear. One is that capacity is specific to judgments. It narrows it down. It's not a general capacity, it's a really narrow capacity. So we've got, as it were, a mental mechanism about a very small decision-making area. But now the problem is we can't do the metaphysics of mind to tell us what that mental mechanism is. And our only access to whether people have capacity in this narrow area is performance. But what's performance? Well, it's not making unwise decisions. Now, I don't want to say that it's impossible to use the Mental Capacity Act. I don't want to say it's impossible to make an assessment about whether somebody is in a position to make an unwise decision with capacity, that they're making the unwise decision doesn't imply that they don't have capacity. I don't want to say it's impossible, but I want to say there's a fundamental tension here. The narrower we squeeze the notion of what capacity is, it is judgment specific, that's built into the act. And the more we play up the idea that you are free as a person, as a patient, to make an unwise decision, the more we have a problem. It's a problem that would be solved if the mind was software and we could validate the software. I'm told that in the 1960s, when AI was first getting off the ground, one of the things that any decent software programmer had to provide was a logical proof of the consistency of the software program. And for a time, there was a real debate about whether this should go forwards into the future. Imagine that. That would never work. These days, we just think, does it look as though it works? How many errors, how many glitches does it generate? We don't do that even for computer software. Well, we certainly don't do it for the mind. So what's the measure of an ability to make a decision in a particular area? Well, performance, I want to suggest. And that suggests a tension between the two requirements of the Mental Capacity Act. Okay, that's the end of the first third of that bit. I waffled on quite a bit at the beginning, so don't worry too much about the time. We're going to go more quickly. So we now move to 2 and 3. After 2 and 3, I'll then say what's so wrong about paternalism. Then I'll talk about the sticking plaster of narrative. That's the deal. 2 and 3 both concern recovery. And I'm just going to tell you a story about recovery. Okay, here's the story about recovery. So recovery was an innovation in mental health care in the 1980s and 90s, and it's begun to run out of steam. National NHS trusts changed their stationery to say we are recovery-oriented services, and then mental health service users began to be suspicious about recovery. One of the reasons why people are suspicious about recovery is it looks like a back to work agenda. I have no views on that today. But recovery came about because of two things, and they're quite different. Let me mention one and then reject it. One of the reasons why people began to talk about recovery in mental health care, I should say, go all the way back to German psychiatry at the start of the last century. And there's a real thought that built into a diagnosis of certain forms of mental illness, schizophrenia, for example, built into the diagnosis was the impossibility of recovery. That's what it was. If you had a mood disorder from which you might remit, you didn't have a certain sort of illness. If you had a certain sort of illness, you would not get better. So the idea of talking about recovery for psychosis is a radical thing compared with end of 19th century, early 20th century German psychopathology. Psychiatrists began talking about recovery in mental health care for two reasons. Well, no, psychiatrists began talking about it for one reason, which was suddenly the thought was the antipsychotic medication worked. And what they meant by recovery was getting better. And that's fair enough. I'm not going to talk about that. There was another reason for talking about recovery from mental illness, which was a service user driven thought, which was you didn't need to get better to be in recovery. Recovery was not about getting better. So what was recovery? Well, I had a look at some manifestos about recovery, and I wrote, I'm not massively proud of these papers, I have to say. I wrote a few papers about the nature of recovery in which I tried to extract from manifestos what a conceptual map of recovery might be if recovery is not about getting better. What is it if it's not about doing that? And I think I concluded that there were a couple of things that seemed to me to be essential about it. One was that it had a focus on the nature of well-being or flourishing rather than an absence of pathology. And the other was that in thinking about the nature of well-being and flourishing, patient or service user or person-specific values were key. It was an essentially value-laden notion of the aims of mental health care. And that makes it different from, say, certain sorts of kind of biomedical views of illness, which might quite plausibly and straightforwardly say what physical healthcare is all about is returning people to statistical normality. Now, in this group, you'll have sophisticated views of the possibility of value-free, statistically normal characterizations of healthcare. You'll have sophisticated views. But at least it was the case that recovery as an approach to mental health care wore its heart on its sleeves and said there is no possibility of a value-free conception. And it's not even a general conception of what the aims of mental health care are. The aims of mental health care are always person-specific and value laden. And I take it that that's what the manifestos were all about. And I take it that that's what they were all about because they were all about opposing a shameful history of paternalism in mental health care. So that's my twofold thought about what recovery is. We concentrate on an aim, not on an avoidance of a negativity. And the aim is person-specific and essentially value-laden. And then it's up to the recovery movement how it conceptualizes that. So let me just mention one way of conceptualizing it. One of the philosophical resources that have been borrowed are those of Amartya Sen's welfare economics. And what's really interesting about this is that Sen says when we're distributing money in a welfarist way to other countries, more broadly in thinking about welfare, we don't just divide up the pot of money and hand it out. We think what we're going to do with it. And the way we think what we're going to do with it is we think, what should people be able to enjoy? Sen uses the rather unfortunate quasi-technical terms functionings and capabilities. And you need to go and read Sen to work out precisely what he means by them. But the idea is we set up some things that people ought to be able to do, and we fund them to be able to do that. And that makes sense in welfare economics, because in some cultures, to be able to do those things will cost less, and in other cultures, it'll cost more. So we don't just divide up the pot, we divide up the pot in a way that it produces equal benefits. That's sort of the plan. And then this idea got applied to recovery and mental health care in the UK. And what's interesting about that is that Sen, and at the time, the person who, according to Wikipedia and so on, is described as being in a loving relationship with Sen, Martha Nussbaum, in the introduction to a book on this, describing quite different ways. And let me name the two sort of opposing thoughts, and then I will, if you'll forgive me, read out a quote from their collectively written introduction to their edited collection. So here are the two views. Sen says, what's really important is that people can differ in what they want to do. And their difference really matters. And we should give them that freedom. We should fund that freedom. So people in recovery from mental illness should feel free to have a series of options, a wide range of options. And what's more, having a wide range of options is one of the valued options. There's a kind of meta connection back. Being free to do something you don't want to do is valuable, says Sen. So the recovery model should fund that too. We shouldn't just fund what you want to do. We should fund your freedom, your contingent freedom to do other things, were you so to wish to do that. Because even the path not taken brings you benefit. That's the thought. And in thinking about that, which I think there's much truth in that, Sen stresses difference. He stresses, I want to use the word subjectivism. Nussbaum, being the Aristotelian philosopher that she is, thinks that there are limits to choice. You shouldn't want to do certain sorts of things. Certain sorts of things simply aren't forms of human flourishing. So I'm now going to read the quote. It's on the slides. If you look at the slides after the fact, it's 2 slides. So this is how long it's going to take me. Okay. So they say in their collectively written introduction, and so bear in mind again, this starts with welfare economics looking at, say, funding third world countries. So it's an all what we've got to keep in mind is that this then becomes an analogy for mental health care. It gets applied to recovery, but the way it's expressed in the introduction is welfare economics. Keep that in mind. Okay. Should we, they say, look to local traditions of the country or region with which we're concerned, asking what these traditions are regarded as most essential to thriving, flourishing, let's say? Or should we instead seek some more universal account of good human living, assessing the various local traditions against that universal account. If we stick to local traditions, this seems to have the advantage of giving us something definite to point to and a clear way of knowing what we want to know, coming out of reading it. So in other words, if we're thinking about whom to fund in our welfare economics, we could look at what local cultures want, and that gives us a really specific target to fund. It seems as well to promise the advantage of respect for difference instead of telling people in distant parts of the world what they ought to do and to be. The choice is thus left to them. So this is, I want to say, kind of the subjectivist side of these things. On the other hand, they continue, most traditions contain elements of injustice and oppression, often deeply rooted, and it's frequently hard to find a basis for criticism of these inequities without thinking about human functioning in a more critical and universal way. The search for a universally applicable account of the quality of human life has, on its side, the promise of a greater power to stand up for the lives of those whom tradition has oppressed or marginalized. But it faces too the ethical danger of paternalism, for it's obvious that all too often such accounts have been insensitive to much that is worth and of value in the lives of people in other parts of the world, and have served as an excuse for not looking very deeply into those lives. So we get in this introduction to a book, which is a book about how to introduce Sen's welfare economics into a model of recovery in mental health care in the UK. We get the two thoughts. On the one hand, we can look to what people really want and fund that as a welfarist approach to mental health care. We respect their subjectivity. Or on the other hand, we might think that some things are just wrong and we're not going to fund that. And the problem about that is that might look like paternalism. And Sen and Nussbaum encapsulated their relationship and in their academic writing, this tension. Sen stresses diversity and subjectivity, brackets, and the risk is going to be subjectivism. Nussbaum stresses a decent, as it were, Aristotelian view of what flourishing must be for humans and risks paternalism. Okay, I've got 4 minutes before my 45 minutes is out, so I'm going to move on. And having lodged that as a question at the heart of theorizing about recovery, I'm going to highlight it as it applies in mental health care, still in recovery. So this is 3. I'm now predicting I'm going to go out of time by about 5 minutes. Okay, so here's 3. What should we think about in thinking about respect for the individuals or respect for generalities when it comes to recovery and mental illness? Larry Davidson, professor of recovery at Yale, I think he is. I had him over for a conference. Lovely bloke. Loved him a lot. Great guy. Drinks beer, talks good sense. Larry Davidson, in stressing the recovery agenda, says the following thing. This is, I think, the last quote I'm going to read. He says, there can be no recovery in mental health care without self-determination. Mental illness may pose an obstacle to the person's achievement of the kind of life he or she wishes to have, may make it more difficult to live that life, and at its most extreme may even deprive the person of life altogether. In none of these cases, though, does mental illness fundamentally alter the basic nature of human beings, which is that of being self-determined agents, free to choose and to pursue the kind of life they as individuals value. Mental illness, he says, does not rob people of their agency, nor does it deprive them of their fundamental civic rights. Now, I want to say that's obviously rubbish. That's simply not true. If there is a good way of characterizing what mental illness does, I want to suggest, I mean, it may do a load of things, but if you wanted to suggest a single thing that it does do, mental illness is a pathology of agency. Mental illness undermines people's ability to do things, and it robs it at a level which is not at the level of the execution of the agency in the way that, say, having a broken leg does. It robs it at the level of framing that agency. In the slides, I've got a lovely quotation from a case study that Matthew Ratcliffe up at York sets out in his book on depression. And the person involved basically in her depression not only becomes unable to do things, she ceases to understand what it is even to do things. She doesn't understand the rational space of agency. The illness undermines her agency. So although I see where Larry Davidson is coming from, he's trying to say, let's not write off people with mental illness. I think he's obviously wrong on two counts. One is, it does undermine people's civil rights. We detain them under the Mental Health Act, and it does undermine their agency. That is, it seems to me, the most characteristic description of what mental illness even is. So there's a worry about subjectivism there. I'm going to mention an opposing figure, which is the medical anthropologist at Columbia, I think, Kim Hopper. And Kim Hopper says that there's a real problem with mental illness, which is that it corrodes people's hope. And so, okay, this is genuinely the final quote I'll read. It's a very short one. Deprivation and disgrace, he says, can so corrode one's self-worth that aspiration can be distorted, initiative undercut, and preferences deformed. Sensitive work will be needed to recover that suppressed sense of injustice and reclaim lost possibility. Now, as the theorist he is, he's really interested in schizophrenia and schizophrenia care. He concentrates on mental health care and the disgrace that that can introduce to people in unfortunate forms of mental health care. But I want to follow Matthew Ratcliffe's notion of depression and think it may not be the health care that undermines people's senses of hope. It may be the illness itself. The illness may be a pathology of hope. Let me give you a very quick analogy, and then I'll move on at some speed. When I was at the height of my depression, I was lucky to have a GP call and say, "What is it that you want, Tim?" And I said, what I want is to be able to get as far as the kitchen. For the last 3 months, I've been stuck in the bedroom. For the last month, I've been stuck in the bed. I'd like to get as far as the kitchen. That's what I want. She said, "I've called you up to ask you what you want. Is that really what you want? You used to go walking in the hills of the Lake District. Do you just want to get to the kitchen?" And I suddenly felt kind of awkward. And she went on, "I think that's your illness speaking. You've forgotten what you want." Now, that's a really tricky thing. I mean, I think she was right, but that's a tricky thing to theorize about philosophically. But I think there's a notion there that it's at least possible that undermining the recovery agenda, which, if you recall, I said had two features. One was it concerns an aim, not the absence of pathology, but an aim for a lifestyle to live. And secondly, that is value-laden and fixed by the person concerned. What happens if the person's preferences are undermined by their illness, as I think marks out depression, but in different ways marks out other people's mental illnesses, other sorts of mental illnesses? Here, I think, again, we have the tension between subjectivism and paternalism. Subjectivism would say the recovery agenda is fixed by the patient, in my case, no matter what little they hope for. And that looks to me to be wrong. It could be that that's the result of the illness. Paternalism would be the clinician saying, this is what anybody reasonably ought to aim at. And they might do that with the best will in the world. But if that's not what I want to aim at, that's a bad thing. So let me, in 2 minutes, give you the last 2 bits of the talk. First, so what's wrong with paternalism? I think of the agenda of the Mental Capacity Act. I think of recovery. I think if the way in which it theorizes about recovery, I think in the way in which theorists of recovery then mistakenly, I think, misunderstand the nature of mental illness out of an optimistic sense of possibility. And also a couple of other things that I could have talked about but didn't talk about. I think these are all ways of stressing the importance of the human subject of person-centered care in fixing an agenda for mental health care. I think that's really good. But the risk is they fall into subjectivism. Why do they do that? Well, because they want to avoid paternalism. So, 20 seconds. What's wrong with paternalism? Here are two ways of thinking about paternalism. First, here's what's wrong with paternalism. Paternalism is a status. It's that, let's say, the clinician is right because they have a status, not unlike the pater, the father. So in virtue of being the father, they have a status. Their pronouncements have the weight they have because they have the status of being the pater, the father. That is a bad thing. Here's another way of looking at the role of the clinician. The clinician is an expert, or should aspire to being an expert, in detecting the aspirations of their patients, their clients, their service users. So it's not that they're right in virtue of their status, it's just that they may be right in virtue of their expertise in reliably detecting the antecedent wishes of their clients before their clients got ill. That's my thought. That's the way of thinking what's wrong and what's right about paternalism. Paternalism needn't be evil. It just depends on whether it's not a status. That's the idea. Okay, final thought and then I'm done. The recovery movement is filled with talk of narrative. And I sometimes wonder why. You go to recovery conferences and everybody gets up and gives a narrative. Sometimes the narratives become quite formulaic, which is a bit worrying and almost embarrassing. Why do they do that? What's going on? Well, I think there's a potency in narrative, and I think there's something really therapeutically helpful. When somebody gives a narrative, they frame their experiences in a way that makes sense. And narrative thus serves as one way of trying to block the bad side of paternalism. In other words, paternalism with a capital P, and what's wrong with it? Paternalism is wrong if values are imposed on someone who has a mental illness, as it were, brutally. But if somebody suggests to somebody with a mental illness that perhaps they haven't thought about things without thinking them through the conceptual framework of their mental illness, as my GP, I think, correctly did to me, if they do that, that's not such a bad thing. But what's the mark of those suggestions being right? It's not that they're right in virtue of the status of a paternalistic imposition. That's horrific. No, they're right in virtue of their being embraceable as a way of conceptualizing the possibilities of recovery by, I'm going to use the word patient, by the patient. What's the mark of that? Well, it may be a form of narrative formulation. When I work out what it is that I want, and I see how it hangs together in a narrative, that's a way of getting some sort of constraint on my own thinking. So here's the very final analogy, and then I'm done. Some of you will have been thinking all the way through this. I'm sure you have. The thing that Tim ought to have mentioned was Harry Frankfurt versus Susan Wolfe. That's what I should have mentioned all the time. What's going on in mental health care is a playing out of the debate between Frankfurt and Wolfe about autonomy. And if you recall, Frankfurt has a proceduralist account of autonomy and Wolfe has a substantivist account. In effect, Frankfurt flirts with subjectivism and Wolfe flirts with paternalism. And so as a very final footnote, I want to suggest a way of responding to what I think is an essential tension in mental health care between subjectivism and paternalism, which aims to balance the value of the subject against the idea that sometimes, because of the very nature of mental illness, the subject's ability to exercise their autonomy is compromised. A way of thinking about that is to think, how should we think about autonomy in general? And a way of thinking about that is to think, when should we impose an external constraint on somebody as a measure, as a mirror, to say, do you really think what you think? And then what should be the mark of that imposition? Brute imposition of values from the outside is dangerous paternalism. Gentle suggestion of things to think about, possibly to be rethought through a person's own narrative, that's not dangerous paternalism, but nor is it shallow subjectivism either. And that, I think, is the messy and embarrassing and absolutely not sexy conclusion to the dilemma that I think we have. And I'm done. Thank you.
So I'm not sure what camera I should be in to be in view, but thanks very much for Tim. Like we said, we take like a 2-minute break for people who want to just stretch their legs or do whatever. And then in 2 or 3 minutes, we'll start the Q&A. Yeah, so we have a microphone in the room which can go around. So people in the room, just raise your hand in the old-fashioned way. People in the chat, yeah, write a Q in the chat, and then I'll give the words to you. So actually, we've got a Q in the chat. So Shervin, if I may use your front name, which I think is your front name, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I just had a question. What do you think about nudging? Because as far as I see it, it's not a kind of paternalistic attitude toward the person, like fully paternalistic. And at the other, on the other hand, it is not also a very innocent suggestion. It's a kind of like manipulating. I mean, to a certain extent, it can be considered as a kind of manipulating. And when you nudge a person, you actually believe that the person is, to a certain extent, able to understand you and, like, for example, process certain information in certain ways. So you already judge the person to a certain extent capable of doing rational decisions, but you for example, like set the stage in a way that you expect the person do the action that you want, or whatever. So I wanted to ask, how do you think about nudging, and do you consider it as a kind of like justified way of like dealing with these issues, or like you can think it is more likely to the paternalistic view?
Okay, brilliant. Not a question I've been asked before. So thank you particularly, because I'll now give you a terrible answer, and I'll think about it retrospectively. But I do wonder when we nudge people, we have a sense, there's a sense in which this is a manipulative move. So we have a thought that if we say this, it'll produce that effect. And we may be better or worse at doing it, and our sort of social theoretical or our psychological models may give us better or worse predictive advantage over people. I mean, here's the thing that it seems to me that it really, the key moral thing turns on is to what extent, when we nudge people, are we getting them to do something that they're not in a position rationally, as far as they're concerned at the time, to reappraise. So, I mean, advertisers, there's a sense in which advertisers nudge us all the time. And this is part of the murky moral world in which we just live. We accept that. But suppose you're a clinician and you think, I've got a patient who is being thus and so, and they are resisting some of the treatment suggestions that I'm making. But I've been looking up nudge theory, and I think if I say this, not what I'd normally say, but if I say this, that might push them into doing what I'm doing. Well, I'm inclined to say we now know where we're coming from. The nudge is potentially manipulative. It may not be manipulative. It depends on the recipient of the nudge. But I think one of the issues that rationalistic philosophers of my stamp suffer from is that we think there's an all or nothing between, as it were, rational agency and everything which is merely causal. And what nudges rely on is something which is in the hinterland of rational agency. There's an explanation of how nudges work, which is rationalistic. We begin to fill it out in terms of subpersonal beliefs and desires. So it's rationalistic in one sense, and yet it's not fully part of, as it were, somebody's freedom. The way in which we get somebody to buy a dodgy secondhand car is to manipulate them. We don't take a gun to their head, but we manipulate them in a certain sort of a way. And so there's the full resources of paternalism sitting behind nudging. It's not innocent because it's nudging. It's not innocent because it isn't saying you will do this. It could still be paternalistic. So I suppose I'd say it's a psychological technique whose status vis-a-vis paternalism or not depends on the intent and the way in which it's used. That would be my guess. I mean, I could really imagine some innocent uses of nudging. I could imagine saying to somebody, I've just been watching the golf. Those are fine, fit-looking, athletic people. Why did I pick golf to say that? I don't know. But anyway, imagine I've just said that. And I could imagine that the person to whom I'm talking says, yeah, I really ought to get out a bit. I really ought to get, I've been quite depressed and I've not been going outside. I really ought to get out of it. I don't think raising the very possibility of going outside to the depressed person who's becoming insular, I don't think that's a problem. Raising it as a possibility isn't a problem. But at the point that you manipulate, you guilt them, you shame them into a worldview which is yours, not theirs. Yeah, then that's it. So it's not the nudging as such. It's the use to which the nudging is put would be my guess. But thank you. It's a lovely question. I will go and agonize about that whilst I have my stiff gin and tonic in about half an hour.
So I see somebody has typed out a question. Giles, oh no, sorry, I'm jumping somebody. Okay, Marie Nicolini has a question. Please unmute yourself and speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi.
And see now, lovely, thank you.
Thank you so much. I had a question about your second understanding of the role of the clinician as using their expertise to detect previously expressed preference. Yeah. So I was wondering whether that accounts for adaptive preferences one may experience as a result of their mental disorder. So let's say
no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. No. I hate your question. I hate your question because I worry where it's going. Carry on with your question.
Okay. So yes, for example, a person who hears voices and sort of discovers they like it, or they like the sort of meaning they can infer from it, or, you know, one can elaborate. If they sort of feel like that becomes part of who they are, in that particular case, how do you see the role of the clinician? Because it just seems like these adaptive preferences could be a problem for the expertise of the clinician, but it might not. I'm curious.
You are absolutely right. So I bet you know the literature as much as I do. A whole bunch of philosophers over the last 15 years have tried to work out what the justification for coercive intervention in mental illness might be. And one of the lines taken is something like this: if you can intervene temporarily to restore somebody to full autonomy, then that might be justifiable. Now, as much as you can fill out that picture, that seems to me to be entirely plausible. So the deal is you trump your, in this conversation, I'm always going to use the word patient, forgive me. You trump your patient's autonomy by doing stuff with and to them in the hope that at the end of all this, they will return to their previous autonomous self. And that's fine and dandy, as long as you've got some conceptual hold on what a previous autonomous self is. But if somebody says, do you know, this is the way I want to be, and if you've got a suspicion that this is the way they want to be in virtue of their illness, then there's an epistemic difficulty, whether or not there's an ontological difficulty. There wouldn't be an ontological difficulty if it was something like this. Imagine, I mean, the simplest case, there's a well-known, I'm making this up now, there's a well-known illness which changes people's preferences thus and so. It makes them, let's say, much more indolent. They don't want to go out, they don't do stuff. You realize that if you give them a certain drug, they will regain their proactive activity. They say, I don't really want that because I'm really happy just spending my life inside the house looking out of the window. Now, were you to give them the drug, they might shake themselves down and say, thank God for that, doctor. Now I'm back to how I used to be. It was merely the illness that warped my desires, such that I didn't want you to give me the drug, which would change my desires back. Ontologically, no difficulty at all, it seems to me. Epistemically, huge difficulties. Who is to say what the authentic view is? And if you look at the last kind of 15 years of philosophers worrying about this, well, sometimes I think of a paper by Natalie Banner and Derek Bolton, and they say it's too difficult to work out what somebody's authentic self is. So we're just going to go with some temporary notion. If a temporary intervention returns somebody to how they were yesterday or a month ago, that's fine by us. But that doesn't address the conceptual question. What happens if it's long term? And what do we think about the possibility that somebody's preferences might be fixed by, as it were, pathological elements of their condition? I think that's a genuine difficulty. I don't know what to do. If we could help ourselves to the ontology, there'd be no problem. But epistemically, I just don't know how you do it.
I see that Simona has a hand. Is that on this point, Simona, or is it separate?
It's a different point. I raised my hand before. Sorry, before I understood that I didn't have to raise my hand.
Okay.
So,
do you wanna go?
thank you very much for the talk. So I have a point of really curiosity about one of the things you said, and perhaps a point of disagreement. Where would you like me to start?
Wherever seems convenient to you.
Curiosity, because I'm really interested in what you said about the Mental Capacity Act. It's a big puzzle for me, the Mental Capacity Act and the criteria over which we determine people's capacity. And I found it fascinating how you deconstructed that to basically distill the idea that the last one is what we are really looking at, the ability to balance up and arrive at a choice, which seems to be much more substantive than procedural. We're looking for a particular choice. Yeah. The problem that I have, and that's my question, is you presented it as, well, we want 5 + 6 is 9. We want the correct answer. But in clinical practice, there isn't often one correct answer. There might be option. There might be one more optimal option according to one clinician and one more optimal option according to a different clinician. So often it isn't 5 + 9, but it is, shall we go for this option, which is likely to serve these purposes at these costs, or this other option? So would you say that to be merciful to the Mental Capacity Act, that distilled last criterion might still preserve somehow the autonomy of the patient, in that it enables the patient to make the choice between two options, or less mercifully, that criterion saves the trouble to the clinicians of making the substantive choice between the two not very clear-cut options. So that's a curiosity I had in mind. What's the purpose of that? Is it, you know, does it save the autonomy, or does it save the choice, the burden of the clinicians?
Okay, so to respond to that, so I'm an old Wittgensteinian. I mean, that's who I am. I'm an old Wittgensteinian. So it seems to me that what it is to have a certain sort of capacity is measured by performance. And one of the things that goes on in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations, when he's trying to describe what it is to follow a rule, there's a lovely description at some point where he says, "I experience the because." And what he means by this, I think, is he's hypothesizing the idea that one might be in a position in which having a mental mechanism that is reliable and delivers answers, you yourself, as the embodiment of that mental mechanism, experience the way in which the mechanism delivers the answer. You experience the because, but you don't. We never do. We don't experience the because. So somebody says to me, "What's 7 + 5?" and I give an answer. I don't experience the because, I just give the answer. Do I know how to add? Well, not because of any experiential quality. Ask me enough questions. If I get enough answers right, then you will ascribe to me the ability to add, and I will self-ascribe the ability to add. One of my great embarrassments as a school child was suddenly thinking I understood how long division worked. And I said to the teacher, teach, don't worry, stop teaching me. Just give me some questions. I'll go home and I'll solve them all. I know how long division works. Came back the next day, got them all wrong. Turned out I didn't know how long division worked. Not because I did or didn't experience the because, the mark of my ability to do long division. In other words, the mark of my capacity to do long division was performance. Now, I think, okay, and I didn't talk about that today because I was being hand wavy in a terrible way. But if you were to get me on with longer time to talk about it, I'd try and unpick all other ways of saying what capacity might amount to, which were independent of performance. And my claim is going to be there aren't any. Capacity is performance. Now, normally, of course, we can ascribe a capacity to somebody who's once in a while blunders. We say, well, they generally know the way. For example, they can negotiate London using an A to Z, but today they got it wrong. Today they ended up in the wrong pub. We still say, normally they know how to do it. They've got the capacity to navigate, but today they got it wrong. The problem about the Mental Capacity Act is that it slims down what capacity is. Capacity is now decision specific. And so now the question is, what is it to have decision specific capacity, but to be wrong? This may be the only time you make that decision. The capacity to make that decision may be exercised once and you come up with a wrong decision. What are we going to set wrong? By wrong, I mean unwise, wrong by communal standards. What's the metaphysical or ontological underpinnings of the statement? This is somebody who knows how to make this type of decision, only ever exercised once, and they came up with a non-standard answer. And that's what bothers me. I don't want to say that this is impossible across the board. I just want to say there's a tension. The tension is twofold. It's that the Mental Capacity Act says decision-making capacity is decision specific, and it says capacity is independent of unwisdom. And you can't have it both ways in the limit. Maybe you can have it both ways in the generality. What you do to have it both ways in the generality is you don't mean very decision specific. It's not that specific. That'd be one way of doing it. And when you say it's independent of unwisdom, you mean, I don't mean it's generally independent of unwisdom. They've got to make most decisions that we'd agree with. That's the tension, is that in the limit, it's impossible. And what we normally do is we manage by not going to the limit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My other point I'll put in the chat because I don't want to take other people's time, and the hope that then if there is time you can attend to it in the chat. Thank you.
I don't mind either way. I'm with whoever is. I'm with the chair of the session. I will do what I'm told to do.
Yeah, I'm the chair. No, I'm the chair. So I think that's an excellent idea, Simona. Thank you, because there's a few more questions. So we have Giles Newton House, who's written in the chat. I've been a consultant psychiatrist for 15 plus years. Here's a thought and a question. The thought is, I only see patients when they are sick. So how do I avoid the charge of wild hubris if I suggest I could be an expert in an antecedent will and preference of a patient? Because he hasn't seen them when they were healthy. And the question is, how do you avoid a perspective problem? So the person deciding if you have capacity is the psychiatrist.
Yeah,
and so it's fundamentally paternalistic.
yeah,
So he says, in other words, I was hoping you might be able to throw me a rope, but still down a paternalistic whirlpool for me. So Sim.
Well, I'm envious of you having your cat with you. I don't have my cat with me. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to help you. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to help you. It seems. Look, it seems to me that the best I can do by way of helping you is to address what might be contrasting mythologies. So, what I wanted to do in talking today was to try and say there's something wrong with one conception of paternalism. And there's something wrong with one free and easy approach to people's individuality, which might lapse into what putting the word ism at the end of it is supposed to be pejorative, namely subjectivism. Those are the mythological limits that we're dealing with, both of which I think are wrong. What I wanted to open up was the possibility of a middle ground in which one could feel relatively honorable. Not brilliant, not uncompromised, but relatively honorable. So imagine this: you're talking to somebody, and you begin talking. They've got an illness, and you're trying. Imagine, I don't know whether you do this, but imagine that you're trying to follow a kind of recovery agenda approach for them. You're saying, we're going to direct resources and care and help to you in accordance, roughly speaking, with the recovery agenda. Namely, we want to know how you want to live, whatever your ongoing symptoms are. So you may carry on hearing voices and so on. You may have some mood swings. Some of them will be controllable with drugs, but some of the drugs will cause you other problems. So, I mean, it's all there in the mix. We want to help you to live the life you want to live. And that's how you start off. Now I want to imagine two situations. With one patient or client, you feel you know where they're coming from, and things work reasonably smoothly. They say things to you, you respond to them therapeutic, as it were, psychotherapeutically almost. You respond and you say things and they look appropriate and they respond, and there's a dialogue which is working well. Imagine a good day at the office. There, I think, philosophically and practically, we might have a sense of middle ground. Not the terribleness of subjectivism, not the terribleness of paternalism. That's where we are. Now imagine the second one. This is more interesting. You try and make sense of what they want, and they say things and you don't really understand what it is. And you might come away with two sorts of thought. I mean, there may be two thoughts in your thinking about them. One is, maybe this is an expression of their supreme depression. Matthew Ratcliffe has this lovely vignette in which somebody has no idea what people are doing when walking dogs in the park opposite the locked ward in which they're based. They have no idea. Not only would they not be able to walk a dog themselves, they have lost the conceptualization walking a dog. They've lost that description of what an action is for. Now, with that person, you could imagine, I could imagine, forgive me, I'm not a clinician, as you know, I could imagine thinking, well, maybe the reason we're not making much headway in the conversation about setting a recovery agenda is that they're really very depressed. But maybe it's the case that they were never into that stuff anyway. They were never into being outside. And that seems to me to raise an epistemic question. You encounter them, you're trying to work out what they would have thought prior to an illness. There is the skeptical hypothesis that they think currently what they do think, not in virtue of their authentic self, but in virtue of their illness. And you just got a snapshot. And what I want to suggest is that a bit of philosophy is not going to help you on that. I mean, well, it won't. Come on, let me be honest. It won't help you. But at least it would offer you two hypotheses. Hypothesis number one is, my way of interacting with you is premised on a kind of shared understanding of the human life, maybe an Aristotelian understanding of what it is to flourish. And I'm going to start with that. And if there are deviations from that, maybe that's a feature of illness. Thought number two goes, I will in my clinical life encounter people with very, very different lifestyles who hope for different things, wish for different things. And with those people, my benchmark of what's normal is going to be misleading. Well, at least if you've got a thought that those are two options, then at least you're not going to assume the first has to be true when it could be the second. You're going to have a kind of epistemic humility. That's not me helping you with your clinical work. That's me suggesting a kind of that two frameworks for thinking, two different descriptions for what would look like the same encounter. The encounter looks the same because things don't go well in your conversation with them, but they might be going badly for two different reasons fundamentally. Yeah, sorry, that's rubbish. I'm sorry that's rubbish, but look, there's only the philosophy doesn't solve practical problems always. What it does do is it gets rid of assumption. Sometimes it gets rid of assumptions that make for more practical problems.
I think that's very nicely put, actually, in what philosophy does. Arjun, you had a question, is that right?
Thank you very much. I had a sort of question, sort of worry about the setup that, paternalism is being used in a pejorative way, and subjectivism, or the subject, seems to be conceptualized in vacuo almost. So I wonder how you might conceive of a subject developing values, aspirations, desires in a vacuum, right? In the absence of some kind of paternalistic, perhaps, influence on their, lives. So the example, so I'm a father, right? And I have a child, and my child doesn't like playing the piano, but then I think, if I make him play the piano, if I make him learn, and he now has the option to play music, I have given him a freedom by imposing something on him that he doesn't like, right? Even more generally, there's no way out of the fact that I might want to, find the person within him and release it. But that's probably a fallacy, really, that there's some degree of influence that I will have. There's some degree of generating a person that goes into this relationship. So this subject, which you seem to think that we need to uncover, I don't know where that subject exactly is.
No. Okay. Okay, good. So in a sense, you've raised an issue about paternalism, where even my pejorative sense of paternalism might actually be the right response. In other words, being a father. What seems to me, I suggested that where paternalism went wrong was that paternalism was a status where a clinician had an attitude to a patient, let me again use that word, had an attitude to a patient modeled on a certain sort of father-offspring relationship. And what's wrong with that is that it fundamentally undermines the autonomy of the patient stroke service user. That's the worry. The worry about medical paternalism in the history of psychiatry is that clinicians have assumed, for reasons that aren't stupid, I mean, because mental illness does undermine autonomy, but they have too swiftly embraced the idea that what they say is right for the patient simply is right for the patient. And the last 40 years of the mental health service user movement has been to say, fuck off, not fuck off, sorry. Don't do that. We really don't approve of that. We want, here's a way of putting it. We may lack capacity in some decisions, but we have loads of capacity in other decisions. But it's a really interesting question what we should think about genuine father-offspring or mother-offspring relations, where what's going on is the framing of character in the first place. And here I think there is a kind of standard Aristotelian story. So it's Nussbaum, not Sen, in the theorizing about recovery in my talk earlier. Or it's Hopper, not Davidson, because Hopper says, when we think about recovery, we should start with a list of reasonable capabilities and functionings. He's been reading his Sen, obviously. Well, what's going on in that debate is the idea that there is a way to be a flourishing adult human, and the role of parents is to draw their offspring towards it. It's to open their offspring's eyes to possibilities that their offspring might not see. And I have to say, I think with that, we just think that's reasonable. I mean, I have to say, we don't think that the paternalism that attaches to parents is a bad thing. We just think I don't know who I mean by we. The bad thing is when we take the model of the paternalism of parents and small children and we apply it to clinicians and adult mental health service users. That's the bit that goes wrong. So in answer to the question, what would be the framework for thinking about a parent-offspring relationship in which you open the eyes of the child to possibilities they didn't previously experience? Well, I mean, I'm not a philosopher of education, but I would have thought that that was just par for the course. I mean, that's kind of reasonable. If it would be subjectivism gone mad if we asked a 5-year-old what their educational syllabus should look like, and they said, much eating donuts and perhaps playing football a bit and nothing else. And we said, fair enough, that's what we'll give you 10 years of. That'd be crazy. So paternalism, when it comes to real parents, yes, that works. And that's why I suggested that I wasn't entirely against paternalism, even in the area that I'm concerned with. What I think is wrong is the brute imposition of values on other human agents who putatively have autonomy. And the easiest way around that is the way that, as I said in the questions, has gone on for the last kind of 15 years in the philosophy of psychiatry, namely, it's entirely fine to be coercive as long as what you're being coercive about is to return somebody to autonomy through a brief intervention. The difficulty of that is that doesn't apply to people with long-term mental health conditions where there is no possibility of that return. So the Banner Bolton story, for example, I mentioned them because Bolton is late of your parish, doesn't work across the board. That's the problem with it. It doesn't work across the board. But when it comes to parents and kids, I'm not going to say anything today.
I think that, I mean, there's a few more questions in the chat that I encourage people to look at. I mean, I have a question myself, but I also think we're out of time. So I suggest that we wrap things up. Tim, thank you very much for joining us today. Perhaps everybody wants to unmute.
You've gone mute. You've muted yourself, which is probably all to the best, frankly.
Have I?
No.
Have I muted myself?
I think it's okay now.
It's okay now. What did I do then? Oh, well, never mind. Never mind what I did. I clearly lack capacity with respect to microphones. Okay. So what I wanted to suggest that everybody unmutes themselves and gives Tim a round of applause. So please do that.
Yeah, thank you.
And with that, thank you again, Tim. Thank you, everybody, for joining us in the discussion. Do read through the rest of the questions and comments in the chat. Well, I mean, it's not an order, but it's an invitation to everyone. We'll be going for a drink, and we have another seminar in, I think, 2 weeks. I think Evelina will probably post in the chat the link to the next thing, or look on our website. And then thank you, everyone, and we'll hope we'll see you again.
Could I just say one final thing before I go, which is to say, if anybody wants to email me. I'm nerdishly available to email questions and conversations. So I'll try and give satisfaction that way if I fail to give satisfaction on the chat. Okay, lovely. But thank you for inviting me. It's been great fun.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.